Philippe is currently professor at the Collège de France. He is the director of the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale and also director of studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Social Science. And he has a number of well-known publications to his name, beginning with his monograph on the Hachois, La Nature Domestique, which was translated by CUP as, it's in the Society of Nature, isn't it? Yeah. And then he wrote in fact, while he was here for that year, he wrote a book translated as The Spears of Twilight. And he's written many other things since, and most recently he tells me he's finished his blockbuster manuscript, which is the comparative study of the social relations of nature. So, Philippe, welcome, and over to you. Philippe is going to talk to us on towards an ontology of socialities. Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, Steve. Well, it's the third time, in fact, in almost 25 years that I have the opportunity to present a paper at the Friday seminar. And it is always with great intellectual profit and pleasure that I do so. On the two previous occasions, my papers dealt with ethnographic problems that were specific to the lowlands of South America, which is my field of geographical specialization. As you will have gathered from the bizarre title I gave for this paper, this will not be the case today.
I thought not.
My purpose will be anthropological in the broad sense of the term rather than ethnographic, although what I will propound is fueled by a lot of ethnography written by others. As some of you probably know, I've been criticizing in the past 2 decades, along with a few others, the manner in which the Great Western divide between nature and society has been implemented in anthropology, and the ethnocentric flows that have resulted from this projection of an ontological dualism upon non-modern societies. However, if criticism is useful, it is not sufficient. It is not enough to show that the opposition between the universality of natural laws and the randomness of cultural diversity is meaningless for many societies. It is not enough to show that it appears lately, this distinction, in the evolution of Western thought, and only becomes fully operational at the end of the 19th century. It is also necessary to integrate this distinction in a new and wider analytical framework where, far from constituting the template that allows anthropologists and historians to gauge distant cultures, it would be nothing more than one of the possible expressions of more general schemas structuring the objectification of things in the world. In other words, it's time to stop flogging a dead horse and to look for a new vehicle with which anthropology could escape from its present leisurely exploration of singularities and proceed ahead with its former project. It is the sketch of this new vehicle which I would like to present in this paper. An absurdly sketchy sketch, I'm afraid. It's so brief period of time, but enough of it, I hope, to give you at least an idea of what I am aiming at. My point of departure is a sort of thought experiment based on a simple intuition that I borrow from Husserl. The idea that we, humans, are equipped to deal with the world with two basic assets, a body and an intentionality. This equipment allows us to generate a specific kind of integrative schema, which I call an identification. That is the elementary mechanism by the means of which I recognize differences and similarities between I and the object in the world by inferring analogies and distinctions of appearances, behaviors, attributes between what I think I am and what I think the others are. In other words, I can attribute or deny to an as yet indeterminate alter. In this case, it would be more correct to say an allude, to distinguish Latin between a determined alter as the term of a relation between when the other term is specified, and an allude as an indeterminate alter. Then to attribute or deny to an allude an interiority and physicality analogous to the ones I believe I am endowed with. Interiority, as I take it here in a very vague and perhaps deliberately vague sense, according to the context, will refer to the attributes ordinarily associated with the soul, the mind, consciousness, intentionality, subjectivity, reflexivity, the aptitude to dream or to signify, or to more abstract characteristics such as the idea that I share with an allude the same essence or origin, or that we belong to the same ontological category. Physicality, by contrast, refers to form, substance, physiological, perceptual, sensory-motor, and proprioceptive processes, or even temperament, as an expression of the purported influence of bodily humors. Whatever the diversity of the conceptions of the person that anthropologists have encountered and studied, the very high diversity, it seems that this duality of physicality and interiority is universally present, although with an infinite variety, of course, of modalities of connection and interactions between the two spheres or the two planes. There is no case that I know of before the modern materialist theories of consciousness, Dennett, for instance, or Damasio, and so on, of a conception of the ordinary living human person which would be based on a pure interiority, let's call it a mind without a body in our own jargon, or on pure physicality, a body without a mind. The distinction then between interiority and physicality, I believe, is not the simple ethnocentric projection of an opposition between body and mind that would be specific to the West. One should rather apprehend this opposition as it emerged in Europe, and the philosophical and theological theories which were elaborated upon it as local variants of a more general system of elementary contrasts that can be studied comparatively. For the identification based on the combination of interiority and physicality are in fact very limited. When confronted with an allude, whether human or non-human, I can either surmise that this object possesses elements of materiality and interiority analogous to mine, and this I call totemism, or that his interiority and his physicality are entirely distinct from mind, and this I call analogism, or that we have similar interiorities and different materialities, and this I call animism, or that our interiorities are discontinuous and our materiality is continuous, and this I call naturalism. These formulae define four major types of ontologies, that is, systems of distribution of properties among existing objects in the world, which in turn provide anchoring points for socio-cosmic forms of aggregation, conceptions of alterity, and definitions of the epistemic subject. Let's examine some properties of these four ontologies. Animism as a continuity of souls and a discontinuity of bodies is quite common in South and North America, in Siberia, and in some parts of Southeast Asia, where people endow plants and animals with subjectivity and establish with these entities all sorts of personal relations, friendship, of exchange, of seduction, of hostility, etc. In these anemic systems, humans and non-humans are conceived as possessing the same type of interiority. Most animals and some plants are treated as persons endowed with a soul which allow them to communicate with humans. And it is because of this common internal essence or faculty that non-humans are said to possess social characteristics, collective behaviors based on the respect of kinship rules, of ethical codes, ritual activity, etc., etc. However, the reference shared by most beings in the world is humanity as a general condition, not man as a species. In other words, humans and all the kinds of non-humans have each different physicalities, in that their identical internal faculties, essences, etc., are lodged in different types of bodies that are often described locally as clothings that can be donned or discarded, the better to underline the autonomy of these clothings or physicality from the interiorities which inhabit them. Now, as Eduardo Viveros de Castro rightly pointed out, these specific clothings induce contrasted perspectives on the world, in that the physiological and perceptual constraints proper to a type of body impose to each class of being a specific position and point of view in the general ecology of relations. Human and non-human persons thus have an integrally cultural view of their life sphere, because they share the same kind of interiority, but the world that all these entities apprehend is different, for their bodily equipment are distinct. For these differences of bodies bear on form rather than substance. This is hardly surprising, as anemic ontologies probably borrow part of their operational schema from the model of the trophic chain. In Amazonia, in subarctic North America, in the circumpolar area, or in some pockets of Southeast Asia, one finds the same idea that vitality, energy, and fecundity constantly circulate between organisms thanks to the capture, the exchange, and the consuming of flesh. So that this constant recycling of tissues and fluids at all levels of the cosmic banquet, analogous to the one which characterizes nutritional interdependence in the synecological process, helps to understand why all these beings who ingest one another cannot be distinguished by the substances from which they are made. And this is why in anemic systems, dietary prescriptions and proscriptions are less designed to favor or to prevent the mixture of reputedly heterogeneous substances, as is the case, for instance, in Chinese or Galenic medicine, than to favor or to prevent the transfer from the prescribed or the proscribed species of certain anatomical features, not substances but anatomical features, or of certain traits of behavior that are reputedly derived from these anatomical features. By contrast, the place that each being occupies in the trophic chain is precisely determined by its organic equipment, since this organic equipment conditions both the milieu accessible to the species and through the organs of locomotion and of acquisition of food, the type of resources that can be tapped in this milieu. So that the form of bodies is much more than the simple physical conformation. It is the entire biological toolkit that allows the species to occupy a certain habitat and to lead there the type of distinctive life through which it is identified. Although many species share the same interiority, each one of them possesses its own physicality under the guise of a particular ethogram. And because of its specific ethogram, each species has then its own Umwelt, in the sense of Jacob von Uexküll. That is, the salient features of its environment are those that are geared to its specific bodily tools, modes of locomotion, modes of reproduction, modes of acquiring food, and so on and so forth. This is why metamorphosis is so important in anemic systems, of course. It is what allows interiority, or what allows, in fact, interaction on a common ground when animals and plants reveal their interiority under human form in order to communicate with humans, in dreams generally, or when humans, generally shamans or ritual specialists, don animal clothing in order to visit animal communities. Thus, metamorphosis is not an unveiling of the humanity of animal persons or a way to disguise the humanity of human persons, but the culminating stage of a relation where everyone, by modifying the position of observation to which he has been confined by his or her original physicality, strives to coincide with the point of view according to which he thinks, she thinks, that the other term of the relation apprehends himself, herself, itself, etc. So the human will not see an animal as he perceives it normally, but as the animal perceives himself as a human, and the human is seen as he does not perceive himself ordinarily, but as he wishes to be perceived, as an animal. It is then an anamorphosis rather than a metamorphosis. Let us now turn to a second type of ontology, where beings in the world share certain physiological and moral properties that seem to cut across the boundaries of species. I call it totemism. in a very different sense, of course, from that which has been attached to the term since Lévi-Strauss attempted to debunk the totemic illusion by showing it can be viewed as a general classificatory device using natural discontinuities as a mental model to organize social segmentation. This was the accepted meaning, which I myself used previously in a couple of papers where I tried, mistakenly as it were, to contrast animism and totemism by stating that while totemism uses discontinuities between natural species in order to map social categories, animism uses social categories in order to map social relations between humans and natural objects. And as Tim Ingold and Viveros de Castro rightly objected, this two-knit inversion in fact ratified the distinction between nature and society, which is inherent to the Lévi-Straussian interpretation of totemism, and thus does not render justice to animism, where this distinction is meaningless. I now believe that this distinction is also meaningless in the case of totemism, a point of view which, in fact, Lévi-Strauss paradoxically endorses to, not in Le Totémisme aujourd'hui, of course, but in La Pensée Sauvage, where he writes by a reference to the totemic system of the Menominee and the Chippewa, the Great Lakes, that in this case, each totemic group has to be taken in itself, and I quote Lévi-Strauss, as it tends to form a system, not anymore with the other totemic groups, but with certain differential properties conceived as hereditary. And he adds a few paragraphs further on. Thus, instead of two images, one social, one natural, which is the famous schema in Le Totémisme aujourd'hui, what we'll obtain is a unique but fragmented social natural image. Social natural image. In that sense, totemism then is more than a universal classificatory device, as Lévi-Strauss argued in the Totémisme aujourd'hui. It is also, and perhaps foremost, a very original ontology, which is best exemplified, of course, by Aboriginal Australia. There, the main totem of a group of humans, most often an animal or a plant, not always, but very often an animal or a plant, and all the beings, human and non-humans, that are affiliated to it, are said to share certain general attributes of form, substance, and behavior by virtue of a common origin localized in space. Now, as Carl Georg von Brandenstein showed very clearly in his thorough analysis of the meaning of Australian totem terms, these attributes are not derived from what is improperly called the eponym entity, since the word designating the totem in many cases is not the name of a species, but rather the name of an abstract property which is present in this species as well as in all the beings subsumed under this entity in a totemic grouping. For instance, the Noongar of Southwest Australia had two totemic moieties, respectively called Marnech, that can be translated as the catcher, and Warda, which means the watcher. And these two terms are also being used to designate the two totems of these moieties, the white cockatoo Cacatua temuirostris, and the crow Corvus coronoides. In other words, the names of totemic classes are terms that denote properties which are also used to designate the totemic species, and not the reverse. That is, names of zoological taxa from which are inferred the typical attributes of the totemic classes. It is thus difficult to maintain, at least for Australia, the classificatory interpretation of totemism, since the basic difference here is between aggregates of attributes that are common to humans and non-humans within classes designated by abstract terms, not between animal and vegetal species that would provide, so to say naturally, by their manifest discontinuities of form and behavior, an analogical template that can be used so as to structure social discontinuities. As ontologies, animism and totemism evidence very different formal properties. In anemic systems, the continuity of relations between humans and non-humans, that is allowed by their common interiority, overrides the physical difference between the terms. This explains both the relational nature of anemic cosmologies and the fact that the contrastive identities of human and non-human persons are defined by the positions they occupy in relation to one another. They are positional identities. By contrast, totemism, in this specific case Australian totemism, is a symmetrical structure characterized by a twofold identity internal to each class, this identity of the human and non-human terms, and identity of relations, whether of origin, of affiliation, of similarity, or simply of inherence to a class. And this twofold identity echoes the twofold ontological identity of interiorities and physicalities. Thus, totemism places on an equal footing interdependent terms and relations. And this has been a motive for puzzlement among anthropologists, and the reason why they've interpreted totemism by favoring either the identity of terms, in the case of Fraser, for instance, and many others, or the analogy of relations, in the case of Boas, Lévi-Strauss, and so on and so forth. The third formula, which I call analogism, perhaps not felicitously, you'll understand why, is based on the fragmentation of all the entities in the world into a multiplicity of essences, forms, and substances separated by minute intervals, sometimes ordered along a graded scale, such as, a very good example is the idea, the topic of the Greek chain of being, which was so common in Europe from the Middle Ages until the Renaissance. This disposition allows for a recombination of the systems of initial contrasts into a dense network of analogies linking the intrinsic properties of each separate entity present in the world. What is most striking in such systems is, in fact, the amount of ingenuousness with which all the similitudes and resonances liable to provide the basis for inferences are actively sought out or sought for, especially as, of course, they are applied in crucial domains of life, such as divination, the treatment of illness and misfortune, astrology, etc., etc. So the obsession with analogy, with analogies, becomes a dominating feature, such as in China, for instance, where I quote Marcel Granet, who says, who writes, "Society, man, the world are objects of a global knowledge constituted by the sole use of analogy." However, this is important, analogy is here only, in my opinion at least, a result or a consequence. Analogy becomes possible and thinkable only if the terms that it conjoins are initially distinguished. If the power to detect similarities between things is applied to singularities. Singularities that are, by this process, partially abstracted from their original isolation. So that analogism can be seen as a kind of hermeneutic dream of completeness and totalization, which proceeds from an unsatisfaction or dissatisfaction. Admitting that all the components of the world are separated by tiny discontinuities, such as in the Chinese Guangmu, the 10,000 essences. Analogism entertains the hope of weaving these weakly differentiated elements in a canvas of affinities and attractions which has all the appearances of continuity. So it's a dream of continuity. But here, the ordinary state of the world is indeed a multiplicity of reverberating differences, and resemblance is only the expected means to render this world intelligible and tolerable. This extraordinary multiplication of the elementary pieces of the world, reverberating within each of its parts, including humans, of course, fragmented in numerous components, themselves divided in successive nesting and partially located outside of their bodies. This appears to be a distinctive feature of analogic ontologies and the best clue for identifying them. What Michel Foucault calls the prose of the world in Les mots et les choses appears to me a very good example of this type of ontology, which, apart from the paradigmatic case of China, is also quite common in some parts of Asia, it seems to me in some parts of Western Africa, or in Mexico, or in the Andes. The last formula is ours. This is naturalism. For naturalism is not only the idea that nature exists, that certain entities owe their existence and development to a principle which is extraneous both to chance and to the effects of human will. Very old definition. Starts in Plato. Naturalism does not qualify only the advent, conventionally situated in the 17th century, of a specific ontological domain, a place of order and necessity, where nothing happens without a cause. Naturalism also implies a counterpart. And this counterpart is a world of artifice and free will, the complexity of which has progressively emerged until it rendered necessary the institution in the course of the 19th century of special sciences that are taught in this building, which were given the task of stabilizing its boundaries and its characteristics, that is, the diversity of expressions of the creativity of humans as producers of science, of norms, and of goods. Now, if one considers naturalism, that is the coexistence, the idea that there is a coexistence between a single unifying nature and a multiplicity of cultures, not as the all-embracing template which allows to objectify any reality, but as one among several others modes of identification, then its contrastive properties appear much more clearly. For instance, naturalism inverts the ontological premises of animism, since instead of claiming an identity of souls and the difference of bodies, it is predicated upon a discontinuity of interiorities and a material continuity. What for us distinguishes humans from non-humans is the mind, the soul, subjectivity, moral conscience, language, and so forth. In the same way as human groups are distinguished from one another by a collective internal disposition that used to be called a Volksgeist, but is more familiar to know under its modern label of culture. On the other hand, we are all aware, especially since Darwin, that the physical dimension of humans locate them within a material continuum where they do not stand out as singularities. And the ontological discrimination, which excludes animal organisms that are biologically very close to us, is a sign of the clear privilege granted in our own mode of identification to criteria based on the expression of our purported interiority, language, self-consciousness, theory of mind, etc., etc., rather than the criteria based on material continuity. Now, each of these four modes of identification comes into public existence under the guise of an ontology which will favor one of them as the main organizing principle of the regime of things, human and non-human alike. And each particular ontology also prefigures a kind of collective more specifically adequate to the gathering within a common destiny of the types of being that this ontology distinguishes. By collective, it's a concept which I borrow from Bruno Latour, I mean a way of assembling humans and non-humans in a network of specific relations, by contrast with the more classical notion of society, which only applies, strictly speaking, to the subset of human subjects, which are thus detached from the fabrics of the relations that they maintain with the world of non-humans. Since such a segregation has little meaning among most non-modern peoples, one must try to treat on an equal footing the principles which allow both humans and non-humans to aggregate in a common world. In other words, sociality is not a given. It is the product of the process of collecting and assembling that each mode of identification operates. Contrarily to a tradition that we share on both sides of the channel, thanks to Durkheim, the property of being social is not what explains, but what must be explained. In order to do this, one must examine for each mode of identification the pattern of distribution of beings in collectives. Who or what is assembled with whom or what? In what way and for what purpose? And I'll do it briefly. Very, very briefly. I'll begin with animism. What are the types of collective that animism renders possible? In animism, you'll remember that all the species endowed with an interiority analogous to that of humans are supposed to live within collectives that possess the same type of structures and properties. But these collectives, which are integrally social and cultural in our language, are also distinguished from one another by the fact that their members have different morphologies and behaviors. Each collective is thus equivalent to a sort of tribe species which establishes with other tribe species relations of sociability of the same type than those which are held legitimate within the human collective, which ascribes its internal organization, its system of values, and its mode of life to the collectives of non-human persons with which it interacts. In sum, all the isomorphous collectives of humans and non-humans take as their model a specific human collective. And to dispel the impression of implicit sociocentrism that such a proposition may seem to imply, I would like to underscore that using categories borrowed from the field of relations between humans in order to qualify relations with or among non-humans in no way amounts to a metaphorical projection. This was a critique that, for instance, Tim Ingold made to Maureen David for the cognoscent in a lively debate in American anthropologists. If polyvalent relations between beings are always formulated in the animic regime, in the language of instituted relations between humans and not in the language of relations between non-humans, it is because there are good reasons of a cognitive type, I think, to explain why general schemas of relation applying indifferently in practice to humans and to non-humans are only become representable and liable to be stated by using the usual forms under which these relations are known within the realm of interactions between humans. First, because these relations between humans are immediately available, enacted daily, always marked linguistically, if only by kinship terms. Then, because they appear more formalized, since their content is specified by explicit rules of behavior, and because their normativity is confirmed by the foreseeable repetition of prescribed attitudes. And finally, because their conformity to a rule may be submitted to public scrutiny, and because the differences in their instituted expressions become more manifest by contrast with those that prevail in neighboring societies. And the public discussion of this contrast is something which is quite common everywhere. To sum up, the best expression of the animic collective is the species. But a species in which the point of view of its members and the point of view that members of other species cast upon them intervene in the definition of its attribute and taxonomic boundaries, by contrast, of course, with the conception of the biological species held by modern systematics. I won't expand much on the sociological formula of naturalism, since it is the one which is most familiar to us, which we've been teaching for many years, and that we deem wrongly as it is to be universal. Humans are distributed within collectives, differentiated by their languages, beliefs, institutions, whatsoever, what we call cultures, which exclude non-humans, that is, nature, artifacts. And the paradigm of collectives is, of course, human society, by contrast with an anomic nature. Everything which is not natural is social. You will notice that if animism and naturalism both take human society as general models for their collectives, they do it very differently. In the case of animism, one can say in a conventional anthropological language that nature draws its specifications from culture, since the majority of beings in the world reputedly live in a cultural regime, and it is only through physical attributes, morphology of bodies, and the behavior associated with this morphology, that collectives are distinguished from one another. In naturalism, by contrast, common anthropological wisdom has it that culture is specified through its difference from nature. It is qualified by default. And although both attitudes, naturalist and animic, may appear anthropocentric, it is only naturalism which is really anthropocentric, since non-humans are defined tautologically, and I use the term non-humans precisely, by their lack of humanity, because there's no other words that we can use for this. As for animism, I think it is better to define it as anthropogenic, in that it contents itself from, deriving from humans only what is necessary in order for non-humans to be treated like humans. The question of totemic collective is rather more complex. In that case, humans and non-humans are jointly distributed in collectives that are hybrid, isomorphous, and complementary, that is the totemic classes, by contrast with animism, where humans and non-humans are distributed separately in collectives, which are also isomorphous, the tribe species, but which remain autonomous in relation to one another. So that if the structure and the properties of animic collectives thus undoubtedly derive from those that are ascribed to human collectives, the structure of totemic collectives is defined by the differential gaps between bundles of physical and moral attributes that are denoted by non-humans, in this case totems, while the properties ascribed to the members of these collectives do not proceed directly neither from humans nor from non-humans, but from a prototypical class of predicates which pre-exist its actualization in specific beings. However, one must distinguish here between, on the one hand, the principles of ontological recruitment into totemic collectives, which do not discriminate between humans and non-humans, and on the other hand, the differentiated functions that the diverse sorts of collectives, of totemic collectives, carry out. In Australia, at least, these functions range along a continuum that goes from an instrumentalization of non-humans by humans, in the marriage sections, for instance, where totemic entities are only contrastive indicators, to an instrumentalization of human by non-humans in the totemic class defined by conception, or descent, where the so-called child spirits perpetuate themselves by appropriating the human reproductive process, using the humans to perpetuate themselves. And passing by an intermediate situation where humans intervene as agents of a finality which is both human and non-human, as the humans are the ritual mediators and the beneficiaries of cosmic fertility, and the case is evident in the rituals of multiplication of totemic species. Thus, by contrast with animism and with naturalism, which use human society as the paradigm of collective, totemism operates an original fusion by mixing in hybrid sets humans and non-humans that use one another in order to produce social linkage, generic identity, and attachment to places. But totemism do so by fragmenting the constitutive units so that the properties of each one of them be complementary and their assemblage dependent of the differential gaps that they present. So that such a system is not driven by a classificatory logic, in the sense of Lévi-Strauss, of one Lévi-Strauss at least, nor by sociocentric logic in the sense of Durkheim, but by a principle that may be called cosmogenic, in the same way that animism is anthropogenic, because it borrows from humans the minimum necessary for non-humans to be treated like humans. Totemism is cosmogenic in that it derives from sets of cosmic attributes, that is, which are not referred to a particular biological species, everything that is necessary for humans and non-humans to be included within a single collective. By contrast with animism, totemism, or naturalism, the analogic mode of identification does not express itself in forms of collective that would be entirely specific to it. For in this kind of ontology, the components of the world are so fragmented into a plurality of determinations that the association of these singularities can take many different forms. But in spite of this morphological diversity, however, humans and non-humans always appear as constitutive elements of a wider collective, since it is coextensive with the world. Here, in the analogic regime, cosmos and society are truly indistinguishable, whatever the type of internal segmentation that such a totality requires in order to remain efficient. For although the analogic collective is identical to the cosmos, it is also internally divided by interdependent constitutive units which are structured by a logic of segmentary nesting. Lineages, moieties, castes, design groups of various nature are here prevalent and expand the connections of humans with the other beings from the infra-world to the empyrean world at the same time as they maintain separate and often antagonical the diversified channels through which these connections are established. And without being entirely ignored, what is exterior to the collective becomes literally an outside world, where disorder reigns, sometimes scorned, sometimes feared, sometimes waiting to be aggregated, incorporated into the central core as a new segment in the appropriate place, that has been allocated for it beforehand. Good example is the quarter labeled anti in the quadripartite division of the Tawantinsuyu Empire that was where the Amazonian Indians were assigned by the Incas without ever being actually incorporated. Analogic collectives are not necessarily empires or states, and some of them are weak in numbers and ignore political stratification and disparities of wealth. However, they all have in common that their component parts are ordered hierarchically, if only at a mere symbolic level. The hierarchical distinction is often demultiplied within each segment, thus delimiting subsets which are in the same unequal relation one to the other than the encompassing units. And another characteristic of analogic collective is the use in all dimensions of daily life of spatial and temporal symmetries and nested inverted structures, a guarantee that no singularity will remain outside the grid network of analogic connections. Another characteristic that just in passing is the use of macro dual divisions like the position between the hot and the cold, or the wet and the dry, which are very efficient dispositions to integrate fragmented systems of atomic elements. To sum up, the analogic collective is unique, divided into hierarchized segments, and in exclusive relation with itself. By contrast with the egalitarian monospecific collective of animism, or the egalitarian also but heterogeneous collectives of totemism that are bound to enter in relation with each other. Thus, the analogic collective is self-sufficient in that it contains all the relations and determinations necessary to its existence and functioning, by contrast with the totemic collective, which is indeed autonomous at the level of its ontological identity, but which requires other collectives of the same type to become functional. For in an analogic collective, the hierarchy of the elementary units is contrastive, that is, defined exclusively by reciprocal positions. Moiety A is only moiety A because there's a moiety B. And it is because of this that the segments do not constitute independent collectives of the same nature than the totemic classes, since the latter draw from themselves, from specific sites, from specific prototypical precursors, beings of dreamtime, the physical and moral foundations of their distinctiveness. So that the segments of an analogic collective are thoroughly heteronomical, in that they only acquire a meaning and a function by reference to the perfectly autonomous totality that they form jointly. And this is why the ideology of such a collective is inevitably functionalism. That is, the idea that each of its constitutive elements contributes in its specific location to the perpetuation of a stable totality. And without making too much of this, one may even wonder if the vogue of functionalism in British anthropology may not have been partly fostered by the fact that British anthropologists devoted a great deal of their time and energy to studying analogic collectives, especially in West Africa or Southeast Asia. Functionalism as a local ideology thus meeting the expectations of functionalism as a method of description and analysis. By contrast, functionalism was ill-equipped to make some sense of anemic collectives, and this in turn may explain why, in part at least, why British anthropology almost completely ignored until the end of the 60s some regions of the world where animism prevails, such as the South American lowlands or also subarctic Northern America and Siberia, but there were also political reasons, perhaps. Just a very few words of conclusion as a sort of comment on the title of my paper. I have no problem with the idea that what we work on as anthropologists is social, since our subject matter are systems of instituted relations. I believe, however, that the forms of aggregation and the types of practice that we call social are not given prerequisites of human action, but result from basic choices. It's a bad, not very appropriate word, but I don't have any other. Basic choices regarding the distribution of ontological attributes to things in the world, which are based partly on some of the objective properties of these things and partly on the dual template, physicality and intentionality, that humans use in order to detect similarities and differences between themselves and these objects. As a consequence of this process, the manners in which the various types of collectives are conceived and the types of interaction that they allow